The cobblestones of Westminster gleamed wet under the flickering gaslight as Thomas Hartwell stumbled through the narrow streets of London in the autumn of 1887. His merchant's coat, once fine wool, now bore the stains of ale and wine from his evening at the Boar's Head Tavern. Thomas had spent the better part of 3 hours boasting to anyone who would listen about his successful cloth-trading business and how he commanded respect wherever he went. The night air carried the scent of coal smoke and horse manure, typical of Victorian London's bustling streets. Thomas clutched his leather purse tightly, feeling the weight of the day's earnings jingling against his palm. He had made a substantial profit selling imported silk to the wealthy ladies of Mayfair, and the success had gone straight to his head along with the considerable amount of alcohol he had consumed. As he rounded the corner near St. James's Palace, Thomas noticed 2 figures standing rigidly at attention. The Queen's Guard, resplendent in their red tunics and tall bearskin hats, stood motionless as stone statues. Their rifles, gleaming even in the dim light, were held at precise angles. These were not mere ceremonial soldiers, but highly trained military personnel tasked with protecting the royal residence. Thomas paused, swaying slightly on his feet. The alcohol had clouded his judgment, replacing his usual merchant's caution with foolish bravado. He had heard stories from other traders about tourists and locals who would attempt to make the guards laugh or break their composure. But Thomas had something entirely different in mind. "Look at these toy soldiers," Thomas muttered to himself, loud enough for the guards to hear. "Standing there like puppets while real men like me work for our living." The guards remained motionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Their discipline was absolute, trained through years of military service and reinforced by the understanding that they protected not just a building, but the very symbol of the British Empire. Thomas approached closer, his footsteps unsteady on the wet stones. The wine had made him bold beyond reason, and he began to see the guards not as protectors of the crown, but as obstacles to his inflated sense of self-importance. "I bet you fancy boys have never done an honest day's work in your lives," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Still, the guards did not respond. Their breathing remained controlled and steady, their posture unchanged. The merchant's frustration grew with each passing moment of silence. In his drunken state, he interpreted their professional discipline as disrespect toward him personally. Thomas had grown accustomed to deference from his employees and customers, and the guard's refusal to acknowledge him felt like a direct insult. Without warning, Thomas reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a rotten apple he had picked up from the street earlier. With a cruel laugh, he hurled it at the nearest guard, striking him squarely in the chest. The fruit exploded against the pristine red tunic, leaving a dark stain that stood out starkly against the military uniform. The moment the apple made contact, the situation changed completely. The guard who had been struck stepped forward with military precision, his movements controlled but unmistakably threatening. His companion moved simultaneously, both soldiers now focusing their attention entirely on Thomas. "You will step back immediately," the first guard commanded, his voice carrying the authority of the crown itself. Thomas, however, was too intoxicated to recognize the genuine danger he had created. "Make me, you pompous fool," Thomas snarled, reaching for another piece of debris from the street. "I pay taxes that fund your pretty uniforms. You work for me." The second guard raised his rifle slightly, not pointing it directly at Thomas, but making it clear that he was prepared to use it if necessary. The bayonet attached to the end gleamed menacingly in the gaslight. "Sir, you are interfering with the Queen's Guard in the performance of our duties," the guard stated formally. "Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Thomas, in his arrogance and inebriation, made the worst possible decision. He stepped forward aggressively, raising his fist as if to strike the guard who had spoken. I'll show you what consequences look like, you—" He never finished his sentence. The first guard moved with lightning speed, bringing the butt of his rifle around in a precise arc that caught Thomas across the jaw. The merchant's head snapped back from the impact, and he crumpled to the cobblestones like a sack of grain. Blood streamed from Thomas's split lip and broken nose as he lay groaning on the wet stones. The pain cut through his drunken haze like a knife, and for the first time that evening, he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The guards stood over him, their rifles now pointed directly at his prostrate form. Other members of the guard had appeared from their posts, drawn by the commotion. Within moments, Thomas found himself surrounded by 6 armed soldiers, each one looking down at him with expressions of cold professionalism. "Thomas Hartwell," the first guard announced, having checked the papers that had fallen from the merchant's coat during the altercation. "You are under arrest for assault upon the Queen's Guard, public intoxication, and disturbing the peace in proximity to royal property." Thomas tried to speak, but his jaw throbbed with such intensity that he could only produce pained whimpers. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, and he realized that several of his teeth were now loose or missing entirely. 2 of the guards hauled him to his feet with little regard for his injuries. Thomas's legs felt like water beneath him, and he would have collapsed again if not for the iron grip of the soldiers supporting him. His fine merchant's coat was now torn and muddy, his dignity stripped away as completely as his consciousness had been moments before. A horse-drawn police wagon arrived within minutes, its wheels clattering against the cobblestones as it approached the scene. The driver, a grizzled constable with decades of experience dealing with London's troublemakers, took one look at Thomas's condition and shook his head in disgust. "Another fool who thought he could take on the guard," the constable muttered as he helped load the injured merchant into the back of the wagon. "They never learn, do they?" As the wagon pulled away, Thomas caught a glimpse of the guards returning to their posts. Within moments, they had resumed their previous positions, standing as motionless as before. The only evidence of the altercation was the small stain on one uniform and a few drops of blood on the cobblestones, which the London drizzle was already washing away. The merchant's night of triumph had become a nightmare of pain and humiliation. His successful business day was forgotten, replaced by the crushing realization that his arrogance had led him to challenge forces far beyond his understanding or ability to confront. Thomas Hartwell would spend the next 3 weeks in Pentonville prison, his jaw wired shut and his reputation in ruins. The story of his foolish assault on the Queen's Guard would spread through London's merchant community, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of alcohol, pride, and the fundamental mistake of believing that wealth could protect someone from the consequences of their actions. The guards, meanwhile, continued their eternal vigil, protecting the crown with the same unwavering dedication they had shown for centuries, ready to face whatever challenges the night might bring. The summer of 1962 brought thousands of tourists to London, drawn by the promise of witnessing the changing spectacle at Buckingham Palace. Among them was Bradley Morrison, a wealthy oil executive from Texas who had made his fortune during the post-war boom. Bradley stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, accustomed to commanding respect in the boardrooms of Houston and Dallas. His expensive suit and confident demeanor marked him as a man used to getting his way. Bradley had arrived in London 3 days earlier with his wife Margaret and their teenage son Robert. The family was staying at the prestigious Savoy Hotel, where Bradley had booked the most expensive suite available. He approached his European vacation the same way he approached his business dealings, with the assumption that money and American confidence could overcome any obstacle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mall as the Morrison family made their way toward Buckingham Palace. Margaret clutched her new Kodak camera, eager to capture memories of their once-in-a-lifetime trip, while Robert trudged along behind them, more interested in the prospect of finding a decent hamburger than viewing yet another historical site. "Now remember, son," Bradley announced loudly, his Texas drawl carrying across the crowd of tourists, "these British guards are just for show. Back home, our Marines would run circles around these fancy dress-up boys." Several British visitors turned to stare at the boisterous American, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to outright disgust. Margaret tugged at her husband's sleeve, sensing the disapproval of those around them, but Bradley was too caught up in his own commentary to notice. As they approached the palace gates, Bradley's attention focused on the two sentries standing at attention in their iconic red tunics and bearskin hats. The Coldstream Guards had been protecting the royal family for over 3 centuries, their tradition of excellence stretching back through countless conflicts and campaigns. "Look at those oversized hats," Bradley chuckled, nudging his son with his elbow. "Probably can't even see where they're going. I bet I could walk right up and they wouldn't even notice." The guards in question were Lance Corporal James Fletcher and Guardsman William Davies, both veterans of the Suez Crisis who had earned their positions through rigorous training and demonstrated courage under fire. They had heard similar comments from tourists countless times before, but their discipline remained absolute. Bradley's voice grew louder as he warmed to his subject. "Back in Texas, we believe in practical uniforms. None of this ceremonial nonsense. A real soldier needs to be ready for action, not dressed up like some Christmas decoration." Margaret Morrison felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as more tourists turned to stare at her husband. She had tried to research British customs before their trip, reading about the importance of showing respect for royal traditions, but Bradley had dismissed her concerns as typical feminine worry. "Bradley, please lower your voice," she whispered urgently. "People are starting to stare." "Let them stare, Margaret," Bradley replied, his chest puffing with pride. "Maybe they'll learn something about real American confidence." Robert Morrison, despite his teenage indifference to most adult conversations, began to sense that his father was heading toward trouble. The boy had inherited some of his mother's social awareness and could see the disapproving looks from the crowd around them. Bradley approached the rope barrier that separated tourists from the guards, pulling out his expensive camera. "I'm going to get a real close-up shot," he announced. "Something to show the boys back at the club." The rope barrier was clearly marked with signs requesting that visitors maintain a respectful distance from the guards. These boundaries existed not only for security reasons, but to allow the soldiers to perform their duties without constant interference from curious tourists. Bradley ducked under the rope without hesitation, his camera raised and ready. Lance Corporal Fletcher's eyes tracked the movement immediately, though his head remained perfectly still. The guard's training had taught him to be aware of every movement in his vicinity while maintaining the appearance of complete stillness. "Excuse me, sir," called out a nearby police constable. "You need to stay behind the barrier." Bradley waved dismissively without turning around. "Just getting one good shot, officer. Won't take but a minute." He stepped closer to Lance Corporal Fletcher, now standing less than 3 feet from the motionless soldier. Bradley raised his camera again, but this time he decided to add some drama to his photograph. "Hey there, soldier boy," Bradley called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "How about a smile for the camera? Don't they teach you Texas hospitality in this country?" The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His breathing stayed controlled and even, despite the growing irritation he felt at the American's disrespectful behavior. Bradley's frustration mounted as the guard refused to respond. In his business world, people jumped when Bradley Morrison spoke. Employees scrambled to fulfill his requests, competitors backed down from his aggressive tactics, and even government officials showed him deference due to his company's economic influence. "I'm talking to you, son," Bradley said, stepping even closer. "In America, we believe in common courtesy. When someone speaks to you, you have the decency to respond." The police constable approached more urgently now. sensing that the situation was escalating beyond simple tourist ignorance. "Sir, you must return behind the barrier immediately. These guards are on active duty." Bradley spun around to face the constable, his face flushed with anger. "Active duty? Guarding what? This is a tourist attraction, not a military base. These boys are nothing more than living statues for the entertainment of visitors." His voice had risen to a level that attracted attention from tourists throughout the area. Cameras began turning toward the unfolding confrontation, though Margaret Morrison desperately tried to blend into the crowd, mortified by her husband's behavior. "Furthermore," Bradley continued, warming to his argument, "I've paid good money to visit this country. My tax dollars in America help fund NATO, which protects this entire continent. I deserve a little respect and cooperation." Lance Corporal Fletcher had endured enough. While the guards were trained to ignore most tourist behavior, direct challenges to their authority and disrespectful conduct toward the crown could not be tolerated indefinitely. "Sir," Fletcher said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of military command, "you will return behind the barrier immediately and show proper respect for this position." Bradley's eyes widened with surprise at finally getting a response, but instead of compliance, the guard's words only fueled his anger. "Proper respect? I'll show you what I think of your toy soldier routine." Without warning, Bradley reached out and flicked the front of Fletcher's bearskin hat with his finger. The disrespectful gesture sent a gasp through the assembled crowd of tourists, many of whom understood the gravity of what they had just witnessed. The reaction was immediate and decisive. Lance Corporal Fletcher stepped forward with military precision, his movement so swift and controlled that Bradley barely had time to register what was happening. The guard's white-gloved hand shot out and seized Bradley's wrist in an iron grip. "You are under arrest for assault upon a member of Her Majesty's Guard," Fletcher announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Guardsman Davies moved to provide support. Both soldiers now focused entirely on the subduing the American tourist. Bradley tried to pull his hand free, but Fletcher's grip was like a steel trap. Years of military training and physical conditioning had given the guard strength that Bradley's executive lifestyle could not match. "Let go of me!" Bradley shouted, his face turning red with exertion and embarrassment. "I'm an American citizen! You can't treat me like this!" "Your nationality is irrelevant," Davies replied calmly. "You have assaulted a British soldier while he was performing his duty to protect the crown." Additional guards appeared within seconds, having been alerted by the commotion. The tourists who had been enjoying the spectacle moments before now found themselves witnessing a genuine arrest, their cameras capturing Bradley Morrison's humiliation for posterity. Margaret Morrison pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please," she begged the guards, "he's had too much to drink. He doesn't mean any harm." Fletcher looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "Ma'am, alcohol is not an excuse for disrespectful behavior toward the crown. Your husband will need to face the consequences of his actions." Bradley found himself pressed against the palace wall, his arms twisted behind his back as the guards secured him with practiced efficiency. The expensive suit that had been his symbol of success was now wrinkled and disheveled, his carefully styled hair falling across his forehead in defeat. "This is outrageous," Bradley continued to protest, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I demand to speak to the American embassy. I want to see a lawyer." "All of those arrangements will be made in due time," Fletcher replied. "First, you will be processed, according to British law, for your assault upon the Queen's Guard." The police arrived within minutes, their black uniforms a stark contrast to the red tunics of the guards. The lead officer took one look at the situation and shook his head with the weary expression of someone who had dealt with similar incidents many times before. "Another tourist who thought the rules didn't apply to them?" the officer asked Fletcher. "American gentlemen who felt our standards of discipline were inadequate," Fletcher replied with dry British understatement. As Bradley was led away in handcuffs, he caught sight of his son Robert standing in the crowd. The teenager's expression showed a mixture of shame and disappointment that cut through Bradley's anger more effectively than any physical punishment could have managed. The Morrison family's vacation was effectively over. Bradley would spend the next 48 hours in a London jail cell, facing charges that would result in a substantial fine and permanent notation on his travel record. Margaret would spend those same hours on the phone with lawyers and embassy officials, trying to minimize the damage to her husband's reputation and business relationships. The guards, meanwhile, resumed their positions as if nothing had happened. Their discipline remained absolute, their dedication unwavering. They had protected the dignity of the crown and upheld centuries of military tradition, just as countless guards before them had done when faced with similar challenges. Bradley Morrison returned to Texas a changed man, his confidence shaken and his assumptions about American superiority thoroughly challenged. The story of his encounter with the Queen's Guard would follow him for years, a constant reminder that respect cannot be demanded, but must be earned, and that true strength lies not in wealth or bluster, but in discipline, duty, and honor. The autumn of 1995 brought a chill to London that seemed to seep through even the thickest coats, but inside the exclusive clubs of Westminster, the atmosphere remained warm with political ambition and social climbing. Among the privileged elite navigating these corridors of power was 22-year-old Sebastian Thornbury Wells, the eldest son of Conservative MP Sir Reginald Thornbury Wells. Sebastian had spent his entire life believing that his father's position in Parliament granted him special privileges and protection from the consequences that affected ordinary people. His education at Eton and Oxford had only reinforced this sense of entitlement, surrounding him with other wealthy young men who shared his belief that rules were suggestions rather than absolute requirements. The young man stood before his bedroom mirror in his family's Belgravia townhouse, adjusting his silk tie and admiring his reflection. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his complexion clear and unmarked by any real hardship or manual labor. Sebastian had never worked a day in his life, his substantial allowance from his father covering all his expenses, while he pursued what he generously called his political education. "Sebastian!" Sir Reginald's voice boomed from the ground floor. "The car is waiting." The father and son were heading to a Conservative Party fundraising dinner at the Dorchester Hotel, where Sebastian would be introduced to potential supporters and political allies. Sir Reginald had been grooming his son for a political career since childhood, and tonight represented another step in that carefully orchestrated plan. As their Bentley glided through London's evening traffic, Sebastian scrolled through his mobile phone, reading the latest gossip from his social circle. His friends from university had scattered across various family businesses and government positions, all of them confident that their connections would carry them through life without any real effort or achievement on their part. "Remember, Sebastian," Sir Reginald said from the opposite seat. "Tonight you're representing not just our family name but the future of conservative politics in this country. Act accordingly." Sebastian nodded absently, his attention focused on planning his evening's entertainment. After the formal dinner concluded, he intended to meet his friends at several exclusive nightclubs in Mayfair, where his father's reputation would guarantee them the best tables and unlimited credit. The fundraising dinner proceeded exactly as Sebastian had expected. Wealthy donors praised his potential and bright future, while he offered charming smiles and rehearsed political talking points. By the time the event concluded at nearly midnight, Sebastian felt invincible, intoxicated by the deference and admiration he had received throughout the evening. His friends, Marcus Pemberton and Oliver Blackwood, were waiting outside the hotel, both of them already showing the effects of an evening spent sampling expensive whiskey at their club. Marcus was the son of a prominent banker, while Oliver's father owned a media empire that included several influential newspapers. "Sebastian, old boy," Marcus called out, slapping him on the back. "Ready for a real party?" We've got champagne waiting at Annabelle's, and I hear there are some lovely models from Milan staying at Claridge's." The three young men piled into Oliver's red Ferrari, racing through London's nearly empty streets with reckless abandon. They had consumed considerable amounts of alcohol at multiple venues, their judgment increasingly impaired with each expensive bottle they opened. By 3 in the morning, they found themselves stumbling through the streets of central London, their formal evening wear disheveled, and their voices echoing loudly through the quiet neighborhoods. The combination of alcohol, privilege, and youthful arrogance had created a dangerous mixture that was building toward an inevitable explosion. "I say," Oliver announced, pointing toward the illuminated facade of St. James's Palace, "shall we go have a chat with the toy soldiers? I've always wondered if they're real or just remarkably lifelike mannequins." Sebastian's eyes gleamed with alcohol-fueled mischief. "Brilliant idea. Father's always going on about respecting military tradition, but I bet these guards are nothing more than tourist attractions. Probably can't even hold a proper conversation." The three friends approached the palace gates, where 2 members of the Grenadier Guards stood at attention in their traditional red tunics and bearskin hats. These were Sergeant Michael Harrison and Lance Corporal David Thompson, both decorated veterans who had served with distinction in Northern Ireland during some of the Trouble's most dangerous years. Sebastian strutted up to the guards with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His friends flanked him on either side, all 3 young men swaying slightly from the effects of their evening's consumption. "Good evening, gentlemen," Sebastian called out in his most condescending tone. "I'm Sebastian Thornbury Wells, son of Sir Reginald Thornbury Wells, Member of Parliament. I trust you know the name." The guards remained motionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Their discipline was absolute, trained through years of military service and reinforced by deep respect for the institution they protected. "I said, 'Good evening,'" Sebastian repeated, his voice rising with irritation. "Don't they teach you manners in whatever provincial schools produce palace guards? When a member of Parliament's family speaks to you, the proper response is acknowledgement and respect." Marcus giggled behind him, pulling out his mobile phone to record what he anticipated would be an amusing interaction. "This will be perfect for the club newsletter. The night we made the guards break character." Sebastian stepped closer to Sergeant Harrison, now standing less than arm's length from the motionless soldier. "I'm speaking to you, Sergeant. Your silence is disrespectful to my father's position and, by extension, to Parliament itself." The guards' training included explicit instructions about maintaining composure in the face of civilian provocation, but Sebastian's combination of arrogance and political name-dropping was testing even his considerable patience. "Perhaps they're deaf," Oliver suggested, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Or maybe they're just too stupid to understand proper English. Sebastian, show them what real authority looks like." The encouragement from his friends fueled Sebastian's growing anger at being ignored. In his privileged world, people jumped to attention when he mentioned his father's name. Government officials showed deference, business leaders sought his favor, and social climbers competed for his attention. "I demand acknowledgement," Sebastian declared, his voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. "My father sits on the defense committee that oversees military budgets. One word from him could affect your entire careers." Still, the guards remained silent and motionless. Their breathing stayed controlled and even, their posture unchanged despite the increasingly aggressive behavior of the 3 young men. Sebastian's frustration reached a boiling point. The alcohol had stripped away what little restraint he possessed, replacing it with pure entitlement and rage. "Fine. If you won't show proper respect voluntarily, perhaps you need a lesson in who really holds power in this country." Without warning, Sebastian reached out and grabbed the barrel of Sergeant Harrison's rifle, attempting to yank it from the guard's grip. "Let's see how tough you are without your toy gun." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Sergeant Harrison moved with lightning precision, his military training taking over completely. His left hand shot out and seized Sebastian's wrist in an iron grip, while his right hand maintained perfect control of his weapon. "Release the weapon immediately," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of military discipline. "You are interfering with a member of Her Majesty's Guard in the performance of his duties." Sebastian tried to pull away, but the sergeant's grip was like steel. Years of military training and physical conditioning had given Harrison strength that Sebastian's pampered lifestyle could never match. "Let go of me!" Sebastian shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm Sebastian Thornberry Wells. My father will have your career destroyed." "Your father's position is irrelevant," Lance Corporal Thompson replied, moving to support his sergeant. "You have committed assault upon the Queen's Guard, and you will face the consequences regardless of your family connections." Marcus and Oliver, who had expected their friend's family name to resolve any difficulties, found themselves backing away in terror as additional guards appeared from their posts. The situation had escalated far beyond their ability to control or influence. "This is preposterous!" Sebastian continued to struggle, but his efforts were futile against the trained soldiers. "I demand you release me this instant. I want to speak to your commanding officer." "That arrangement will be made shortly," Sergeant Harrison replied calmly, "after you've been processed and charged according to military law." Within minutes, Sebastian found himself pressed against the palace wall, his arms twisted behind his back as the guards secured him with practiced efficiency. His expensive dinner jacket was torn at the shoulder, his perfectly styled hair falling across his face in disheveled strands. The Metropolitan Police arrived quickly, their vehicle's blue lights casting eerie shadows across the palace facade. The lead officer took one look at the situation and immediately recognized the familiar pattern of privileged youth learning harsh lessons about real authority. "What do we have here?" the officer asked Harrison. "Young gentleman attempted to seize my weapon while I was on duty," Harrison replied. "Claimed his father's political position gave him the right to interfere with the Queen's Guard." Sebastian's friends watched in horror as their companion was loaded into the back of a police van, his protests and threats echoing through the quiet street. Marcus had stopped recording when he realized that the footage might implicate him as an accessory, while Oliver was already calculating how to distance himself from the entire incident. "I want my solicitor!" Sebastian shouted from behind the van's metal doors. "My father will have all of your jobs. You'll regret this." The guards had already returned to their positions, their discipline unshaken by the confrontation. They resumed their eternal vigil as if nothing had happened, protecting the crown with the same unwavering dedication they had shown for centuries. Sebastian spent the next 3 days in a holding cell, his father's frantic phone calls having little effect on the military justice system. Sir Reginald's political influence, which had seemed so powerful in Westminster, carried no weight when his son faced charges of assaulting the Queen's Guard. The scandal erupted across London's political circles within hours. Sebastian's arrest became front-page news in several tabloids, his privileged background and arrogant behavior providing perfect ammunition for journalists who delighted in exposing the hypocrisy of the political elite. Sir Reginald was forced to issue a public statement expressing his profound embarrassment at his son's behavior and his complete support for the military personnel who performed their duties with appropriate restraint and professionalism. The MP's carefully constructed political career suffered significant damage as his opponents seized upon the incident as evidence of Conservative Party decadence and entitlement. Sebastian eventually received a suspended sentence and substantial fine, but the real punishment was the complete destruction of his social standing and political aspirations. The story followed him wherever he went, a constant reminder that true authority comes not from family connections or inherited privilege, but from dedication, service, and respect for institutions greater than oneself. The guards who had faced his challenge continued their duty with quiet pride, knowing they had upheld centuries of military tradition and demonstrated that in the presence of the crown, all individuals are equal before the law and subject to the same standards of respect and behavior. Sebastian's fall from grace served as a warning to others who might believe their wealth or family connections placed them above the rules that govern civilized society. The Queen's Guard had once again proven that their authority derived not from politics or social position, but from their unwavering commitment to duty, honor, and the protection of something far greater than any individual's ego or ambition.